Okay. Okay, there we go.
Got it.
All right, just a few more items in the way of introduction. My name is Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden. Once again, I'm honored to say that our discussions on the Optimist daughter will be moderated by my friend and Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, Dr. Suzanne Mars. She's also professor emerita of Millsaps College. Just some housekeeping. If you want to comment or ask a question, look at the bottom of your screen. You're going to want to click the Reactions tab. And with the Reactions tab, raise your hand. Click that raise hand function and I'll help Dr. Mars look for your questions and comments that way. If you're using a tablet or an iPhone, you might want to tap your screen to bring that option up. And speaking of comments, also look at the chat. There's usually a great discussion going on in the chat. People share links and that's really fun. In fact, to start you off, I'm going to share you a little goodie. This is going to be a link to the Eudora Welty Review. The Eudora Welty Review is an annual publication, and it's published and edited by a lot of people who are familiar faces on Welty at home, including Pearl McGaney and Sarah Ford. I'm going to leave somebody out. And Rebecca Harrison. So here is a little link in the chat if you're interested in subscribing to the review. It's got a lot of essays, notes, interviews, and reports from the Eudora Welty Foundation and the Eudora Welty House and Garden and things from our Eudora Welty community. With that, Suzanne, shall we officially begin our discussion on the Optimist daughter?
Let's go.
All right.
I'm going to talk for a little while, so I'll try to restrain myself. But let me just give you some backgrounds before we start. In 1955, having finished a collection of short stories called The Bride of the Innisfallen, Eudora Welty began work on a long comic novel that we have read that would eventually be called Losing Battles. And work on that novel went very slowly because Eudora was facing one family crisis after another. Her mother's eyesight was in jeopardy. She would have to have cataract surgery, which would not solve her problems. Her brother Walter was afflicted with a virulent form of arthritis, the complications of which would eventually claim his life. He died in 1959. Afterwards, Mrs. Welty continued to face vision problems and began to suffer a series of I think somebody needs to be muted, I'm afraid. Yeah. We okay? All right. So Mrs. Welty began to suffer a series of small strokes, and it became necessary ultimately in 1963 for a short time, and then at the end of 1963, again, for her to move to the Martha Coker Nursing Home in Yazoo City, where Eudora visited her on a daily basis and kept working on Losing Battles. Even in the car, she was jotting down notes, and her friends were worried about her safety as she drove over hilly roads back and forth to Yazoo City to see her mother. In late 1965, Eudora's brother Edward fell, broke his neck, and was hospitalized. And then in January 1966, within 4 days of each other, Mrs. Welty died, and then Edward died. Mrs. Welty from a stroke, Edward from a brain infection. In the aftermath of their deaths, Eudora struggled to work on Losing Battles, but found herself really unable to do so, at a loss for words. And then early in 1967, she began work on a new story, drawing upon her experience of loss. That long story would eventually be titled The Optimist Daughter. It went through a series of titles. Poor Eyes was one, P-O-O-R Eyes. And then at the last minute, she proposed The Flickering Light of Vision, but Bill Maxwell prevailed, and they stayed with her editor at the New Yorker, and they stayed with The Optimist Daughter. When she sent it to the New Yorker, it was immediately accepted, but it was not published for 2 years because they wanted to run it in one issue, and they didn't have space for it until 1969, and it was published on March 15th, 1969 in the New Yorker. Jessica, had the bright idea, a wonderful idea, I think, that we would read this story in connection with the published novel, and she has obtained permission for us to do so, and has got, will provide a link, right, Jessica, to scanned copies?
Yes, so we're getting scans made of the story, and we'll be able to share those with you all who are participating in our book club during the last 2 weeks of the club, when we'll be discussing that version of the story. So stay tuned on that.
Yeah, so in a way, we're doing things ass backwards, as my father might have said, but but I think there's a logic to this, and I'll talk about it. Once Eudora had completed The Optimist Daughter in 1967, she returned to work on Losing Battles and saw it published to great rejoicing in 1970, and it became a finalist along with Saul Bellows' Mr. Samler's Planet and Joyce Carol Oates' The Wheel of Love for the 1971 Pulitzer Prize, though the Pulitzer jury decided against awarding a prize that year. So there was no 1971 Pulitzer Prize in fiction. But even as the Pulitzer committee was declining to honor Losing Battles, Eudora was gearing up to return to revise and expand The Optimist Daughter. And it was published in book form in 1972, and it went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1973. And we, hence our project here celebrating that prize. The Optimist Daughter, in both its incarnations, was a response to loss, to the recent and distant losses of much-loved family members, the deep and abiding grief Eudora felt, and the consolation she found are dramatized in the novella. But in addition, perhaps inevitably, she drew more upon actual events and individuals than she ever had before. As a result, she was at first reluctant to publish the story on its own in a separate volume. She felt that placing it in a book of stories would deflect critics from focusing on its source material, but ultimately she followed the advice of her agent, Dermot Russell, and her New Yorker editor, William Maxwell, and transformed her long story into the novella that would stand on its own. In 1980, when she wrote the foreword to the Franklin Library's reprint of The Optimist Daughter, she said this about this process and about the biographical and autobiographical connections. While I was writing The Optimist Daughter, I was living with the fact that the story was very close to me, not in its literal circumstance, but in its concern, its subject, its weight of meaning for me as a person. The time I began it, while I was also finishing Losing Battles, a novel of a very different kind, was soon after the long illnesses of my mother and my brother had ended in the deaths of them both in the same week. Part of the universal experience of personal loss is the urgent wish to find a way back through the exercise of memory and the acceptance of the responsibilities of feeling and understanding to apprehend, absorb, and save some essence of the life that is just over. The imaginary Laurel, through the dramatic circumstances of the story I invented, presses her way back as far as she can seek it out into the life of the marriage of father and mother and its outcome, in the long run coming finally abreast with her own survival and to terms with her own life. Though the story was not like my own, it was intimate with my own, a closer affinity. Writing it involved my deepest feelings. Their translation into the events of the story was demanding of my ability as no other novel so far has been. It taught me all the way, as writing always manages to do. The Optimist Daughter may be teaching me still, since I find it difficult, even after the lapse of time, to write a foreword to it. So, in the course of the next few weeks, we will address the ways in which the lives of her mother, father, brothers, as well as her own life inform the finished work, but we won't make that our focus. Our focus will be on the novella itself, upon the artistry and its thematic structure. We'll begin by looking at the work that was produced as a final revision, the book publication, the work which Welty said, I hope, she said this about the book as opposed to the story, I hope it was simply more what it was meant to be. So we're going to read the version that is closer to what the book was meant to be than the first New Yorker version. But then we're going to look back at the story to see what changes were made and what effect those changes had on the novella's import and effectiveness. We'll ask ourselves which version we prefer and why. So that will be our plan over the next 6 weeks. Let me give just 2 notes on the novel's timeline. 1, the novel begins in early March. It was on Monday in early March, and it takes place during Mardi Gras, with the judge's death coming on Fat Tuesday, and then the novel ending, I take it, in early April. I'm not sure why Eudora decided to say March. And I, for some reason, the first time in all of my readings of this novel, looked up the dates of Mardi Gras in the 1960s when the novel is set, and none of them would Mardi Gras have fallen as late as it falls in this novel, the Fat Tuesday. And in fact, in no time in history would Mardi Gras Fat Tuesday have fallen as late as it falls in this novel. Unless somebody can instruct me otherwise, it seems to me this is just a mistake. I don't know if it was done purposely, if it was accidental, but in any case, I'm not someone who even questioned it until today, and that's a long time after the fact. Beverly?
I also looked up the Straw Hat Day. You know, there was a reference to her father having his Panama hat,
Straw Hat Day,
and that's usually April and May.
Okay.
This was very early for that, so I thought, well, have they changed? I didn't even know there was a Straw Hat Day till I looked it up, but there is.
Right.
And so that date is questionable as well.
Well, or at least he's put it on early if it is. Yeah.
Right.
Mary Alice, you may have the answer here.
Well, I don't know. I said I wasn't going to say anything. I was just going to listen. But this thought popped into my head, Suzanne, and it's been years since I read the letter, but I remember Eudora wrote a letter to someone, and she was talking about when she was in New Orleans with my mother, when my father was in the hospital.
Right.
And taking place. And or maybe I'm not sure Mardi Gras was, but it was the hospital. Anyway, I'm just wondering if that was when she happened to be in New Orleans, not Mardi Gras happening, but
Right.
just the month.
I remember that letter well, and that was, I think, in February at Oshner's, I think, but I'll go back and check on that.
Anyway.
So anyway, I don't think it makes any difference really in the terms of reading the novel, but that was a question I had, so I thought I'd bring it up. The other thing is, I had never really made myself think very deeply about when Becky had died and how long the judge had been a widower, and the novel makes it very clear. He marries Faye 10 years after Becky has died, and it's now been, they've been married for 1.5 years. So we do know that, and I think we can assume that the novel is set sometime around 1967, probably 1967, and that means Becky would have died probably in 1955, and the judge and Faye would have married in 1965. So, having said that, just gives us an idea of the timing of the novel. Again, I don't think it's essential to our reading of it, but I thought it was interesting. And then let me give one more little tidbit of information. Our very devoted book club member, Lynn Evans, who has not been with us for a while because she's recovering from a stroke, once wrote a screenplay or a dramatization of the Optimist daughter. She did so because when Alfred Urey, who wrote Driving Miss Daisy, had been approached by Sally Field, who wanted to have a movie version of the Optimist daughter. And as my memory, and Mary Alice may have to correct me about this, but my memory is that both Alfred Urey and Sally Field visited together Eudora to ask about this. And but that ultimately Alfred Urey decided that he couldn't do it because he thought the story was too interior to be dramatized. But Lynn was fearless and she did it. And we have her version of that. And now we just need to find a movie producer to take it over. So Mary Alice, do you remember Sally Field coming to?
I was just chatting. I ended in the mid-sentence, but no, that's kind of my memory, what you said too. Just mention of it, and yes, that's what I.
Yeah. So I'm sorry it wasn't ever made. It. Maybe I'm glad. I have to say I love Louise Penny, but I can't watch those dramatizations of Three Pines. So I like the books. I'm sticking with the books. Okay, well, let's turn to our discussion of the novel. And we have for today part 1. And we meet the major characters of the novel in a place that is out of town for all of them. So I thought we might talk today about each of those major characters, Faye, the judge, and Laurel, and about New Orleans, the out of town setting in which we begin and how that setting works in the novel. We can talk about, and I think we will want to talk about the Dalzells and anything else that you want to talk about, but I thought we would just start with these 3 characters and New Orleans. So if it's okay with you, I'll ask for comments about Faye. So let's start with Faye. We'll do Faye, the judge, and then Laurel. Oh, Jean, I see you smiling, Jean Medley. Do you want to comment?
Well, Cheryl has her hand up.
Okay, I'll come to Cheryl. Just Jean doesn't want to, I think. No. Okay, Cheryl, go. I'll come back to.
I knew almost immediately that I did not like her.
Okay.
About
How did you know that?
4 or 5 paragraphs in, Faye, small and pale in her dress with the gold buttons, was tapping her sandaled foot.
I wanted to talk about that. We know the way Faye is dressed is very different from the way Laurel is dressed. What about that? What didn't you like, Cheryl, about those gold buttons in that sandaled foot?
It's just the contrast between what Laurel is wearing, but also the tapping. It's not described as like a nervous or anxious tapping because she's concerned with her something's wrong with her husband. It's an annoyed, it's a little girl dressed up and with pretty finery gold buttons and her cute sandaled shoes, and she's impatient.
All right,
that's the impression I got.
Why have I been brought here? Huh? That you have that sense now that she's impatient with her setting. So our first view of Faye is one that's not designed to inspire affection. Okay.
Teresa Schuster, were you trying to raise your hand?
Yes, trying to raise my hand.
Oh, good.
Well, my first thought was I am a second wife to my husband. So unlike Cheryl, I wanted to like her because I am a second wife in a marriage. But I also did not like her. And the first thing I did was, thanks to Suzanne's last class, I looked up symbolism for Faye. And it means fate or destiny. And it also means fairy. So I thought I would throw that out there.
Now that's an interesting one too. So is she the image of fate here in a fairy-like force in the course of the novel? Good question, Teresa. I'm also a second wife. I hope nobody thought of me as Faye. Okay, who do we have? We have Beverly and Helen and Susan. Beverly, you want to go first?
My impression of her was that she was much younger than she actually is. I mean, we know she's not that much younger than Laurel. She's, you know, in that same neighborhood. She's not a 20-year-old bride. So her behavior at the beginning is so immature and so selfish that I had to, you know, I thought, well, if she's in her early 20s and she's married this man 50 years older than she is, then maybe we can cut her some slack. But no, she's not. She's a mature woman, and there's not a lot of excuse for her to behave the way she does, except that she's selfish and immature. And I wanted to slap her constantly.
Hey, Helen, what do you think?
I think that the tapping of the foot is our first indication of time passing. She's impatient for time to pass. She really doesn't want to be there, and it indicates to me that she is restless and wanting to move on. That is just one of the many new themes and metaphors and imagery that's so heavy in these first few pages.
Let's just also say that image of time, that tapping of the foot, links to the carnival where she wants to seize the day, and that whole effort to push on it with time, but not ever aware of the meaning of time's passage, I think. Okay, Susan, and then Lauren. And Mary. Good. Here we go. Susan.
I thought it was really funny that she keeps saying we should let nature take its course. We should let nature take its course. And yet, at the time that the judge discovers that something is wrong with his vision, she's out getting her hair rolled, not letting nature take its course.
Yeah. And that whole business of letting nature take its course, and let's don't question the course of events, but of course she does question them later on. Lauren.
I to say something that it might be a little controversial take, but this time reading, I felt a little more compassion for Faye.
Okay.
And I feel like sometimes she's an easy scapegoat in this book, because the judge did marry her. I mean, she didn't, maybe she seduced him, but she's much younger than him. And so I don't think we can fault her completely for, she is a very annoying person and immature and unlikable, but, it takes two to tango, and the judge married her. And then also I think that ironically, as we see, she kind of was right about the procedure. I mean, maybe it's just because I'm a little more sensitive to like medical negligence these days, but I feel like she had some questions that the doctor glossed over and just dismissed that would have been, were valid concerns. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I know it's a little bit of a controversial take on Faye, but I did feel a little less negatively towards her this go around, despite how annoying and terrible she is.
I think that's an important point to raise, Lauren. And to what extent is she this kind of two-dimensional fixture? Her sobbing, for instance, I had not paid too much attention to that, but at that night when they go back to the hibiscus and Laurel listens to her sobbing in her bed, to what extent is she sobbing for herself? To what extent for the judge? What about her pushing him to live? I mean, he is retreated and is in a deep depression as he's in the hospital, and she is urging him to live. I personally, I'm with Cheryl on Faye. I don't like her, but I think there are complicating factors here that we should look at. Yeah, Mary, and then Laura, and then Harriet, and then Laura. Mary.
Well, one of my observations about Faye is that I don't think Eudora Welty liked her, because she is so much more of a caricature. The other characters are more three-dimensional. And I mean, I don't like her. I mean, I just kind of cringe whenever she's in the room. But for some reason, I think that Welty is painting her in an exaggerated style, but not the others. And we don't have a chance to see Faye and the judge interact before they enter the doctor's office. But I've read the story years ago and I've forgotten it. And when I can't right now figure out why he married her, but maybe that will be revealed.
Well, I think we want to talk about that. I also want to point out that we are seeing Faye primarily through the vision of Laurel. And Laurel it cringes from any sort of sense of her father's intimacy with Faye, I think, when she sees him passing the cigarette back and forth from their mouths. Oh, or when he wakes up grinding his teeth and Faye says, I get that every morning. And Laurel's, whoa, she doesn't want to think about this. So I think that does affect our perception of Faye, although, well, let's see what else you think. Harriet.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think it's too early to point out that this is that the combo of Laurel and Faye is a pattern that we see in a lot of Welty stories that are about daughters, middle-class daughters who are reserved and thinking about a woman who is other class and transgressive. In the way that she makes a spectacle of herself. So now I'm thinking back to Cassie and Virgie Rainey and Miss Eckhart and Nina Carmichael and Easter, or the group, the Bather in A Memory, and the central consciousness narrator. But that these are stories that are in which the other woman is a kind of is paired to the character that we're most interested in. They sometimes appall, and sometimes, but they always attract the attention of these narrators who think on them and think about ways to be a daughter in this culture. And this is Laurel's moment of both thinking about herself as a daughter and also of no longer being one. But a culture that has all ideas about female proprieties, ideas about female self-exposure. And these women who are sometimes awful or sometimes models, they are characters who are impervious to the rules of how a woman should be. And they get to be characters to think on. I was also thinking that I really like the idea of I think we need to say more about the ways in which it's possible to be compassionate towards Faye as the second wife, and also to think about medicine. I think maybe a fourth character we should talk about today is Dr. Cortland and his medical behavior, and tease it out.
Yeah, we thank Lauren for bringing that up too. We can do that. So
Right.
I hope I've got this right. It's Laura and Helen, and then Teresa, I think. Okay, Laura.
Yeah, this is my first time reading, so I have absolutely
Good.
no
Well, I'm
idea
glad
what's
I did. I
coming.
was going to make a very ironic comment about Faye, but it gives away something that comes up. So I'm glad I didn't say it.
Oh.
Go.
Yeah, so I have absolutely no idea what's coming, and I have to say I'm also a second wife with a big age difference. That being said, I still have, every time I was reading this and taking notes, I have just dotted in parentheses, Faye is disgusting. And then I have Faye continues to be disgusting. And it just keeps going through my notes because I just was so appalled. But I was really happy with what Lauren brought up and what everyone else is bringing up, because she's so perplexing. By the time I finished this section, I realized we can't just so obviously hate her, right? I mean, there has to be something else here. And then I was thinking back to how, we hear really clearly what Faye is thinking, more clearly than anyone else, because she says it. She's just very straightforward, as opposed to Laurel, where I feel like I have questions about what Laurel's thinking, and then I have to read and keep reading, and pages later, I'll get an answer to that question. And so, yeah, it did make me wonder, what would Laurel say if Laurel was as forthright as Faye is about this situation?
I think that's a really important point, Laura. And I think that Laurel, we have this sense of kind of a natural restraint, that she's not revealing herself, that she's holding things in. And the course of the novel is going to see that eventually give way. But here at the first, Faye is so, why did this have to happen on my birthday? You know, is so focused upon herself. Why did I have to be shown that when the man vomits the man, and so focused on herself, but so outspoken that we do see this, and we don't see what Laurel is that has that kind of restraint. Yeah, Helen.
I think Teresa is ahead of me.
Okay, Teresa.
Well, I'm starting to like Faye a little bit more after all these discussions. I think Faye, this is, again, I haven't read this novel before either, and I haven't read ahead. I think the doctor married Faye to give himself some joy, as many boundaries as she breaks. I think maybe she provides some lightness, and her directness is well, there's a beauty to that. You never know what you never are unsure or unclear of what she's thinking. So I'm starting to like Faye more. And I'm also more curious about Faye than I am about Laurel. For example, if she married someone that much older than her, you know, she's probably hoping for some stability. And the descriptions of her aren't that flattering, you know, the way her hair is described, the fact that she's so small and immature. I think that Faye feels disappointed. She wanted maybe a few more good years before she had to face the inevitable age difference. And I think that she feels like she's gotten a bad deal, and in a sense she has. So I appreciate that honesty. As much as we don't like it, I'm kind of appreciating it.
Well, yeah, so that she grieves. She's not saying, oh, I'm glad he's dead now, I'll just take my money and run. She's grief-stricken, but she's also grief-stricken for what she has lost in terms of, I think you're right, stability, position, predictable, maybe indulgence. Helen. And then Al.
Well, Welty herself said that Faye was the character that she was harsher on than any of her other characters. There is one point in here that she sees when she sees the little boy with the toe head, powdery toe head. She sees that there's much deprivation in his life, and she thinks that Faye may have been like that. So she has a moment of compassion then, that she thinks Faye may have been like him. And it seems that Judge McKelvey in his loneliness saw her too as someone that he could not only be a companion to him, but that he could lift somewhat out of that deprivation.
All right. Alex. And then Jessica.
Quick thing, and this has almost been said, but Faye, in her selfishness, why did this happen to me? And he said he was going to bring me to New Orleans, but I didn't think it would be like this. I mean, she's saying things that Laurel, in her well-bred restraint, is not saying. But who does not think things like that? And who of us is not selfish? Anyway, that's all. Thank you.
All right. Jessica, and then Jacob.
I also wanted to think about the dynamic between, I think someone in the chat mentioned the natural rivalry between Faye and the daughter and stepmother. Laurel, but also between Faye and Becky. Becky's presence is felt. Becky is the first name, one of the first names that's mentioned right off the bat. And even though it's been 11 years, as Suzanne pointed out, I feel like Becky's presence looms large in this dynamic, in this moment. Everything that's happening with Judge McKelva is recalling to Dr. Cortland and to Laurel things that have happened with Becky, and she's just this unspoken presence that may make Faye feel intimidated or challenged. And I also, so obviously Faye is not a very likable character. There's a lot of garden references. If we get a good point, I've got a lot of pictures that I can share with you about that, but Becky is first referenced in terms of gardening. And Faye, I just made the notices. I think the whole garden kind of represents Becky in a way. And Faye doesn't like that. So Faye doesn't like the garden. And there's a lot of garden references in this part, but every time Faye mentions it, it's always very negative. I just wrote down everything she says about the garden in this part: briars, scratch, thorn, brambles. And my favorite to hate, why didn't those old roses go on and die? So
sometimes I wish there wasn't a rose in the world. Mrs. Welty, as garden man, said to her, and she hated that. Yeah, I think that's right. And as Susan Ford was pointing out to us, Faye, who says let nature take its course, is really hostile to nature. And when the judge, when he wakes up from the anesthesia and he says something about Becky, and Faye says, rushes over to him and says, Becky, who is this? Who is this? You know, so look at me. And I think you're right, Jessica. There is that rivalry with the old wife, as well as the rivalry with Laura. Jacob and Cheryl and Harriet.
Another thing about Faye, this is kind of, maybe it's small. Later on, I think on page 904, we find out Faye isn't from Mississippi. She's from Texas. So my question is, why Texas?
That's bad.
Yeah, I was going to say, is there a history, is there a rivalry between Mississippians and Texans? Because I'm thinking, like in Faulkner world, the Uber villain, Flim Snopes, gets the spotted horses from Texas. Is there like a white trash legacy with Texas? Because I think that's, I don't know, that's a strange detail about Faye that I'm just adding to the pile here today.
Yeah, I do know that there is a kind of state pride in Mississippi that would assert itself. Yeah. Cheryl and then Harriet.
I just really want us to note that in my belief, the judge was on the mend. And this isn't like attack Faye Day, but she physically took action to move the judge out of bed. Now, I think it's Ray who is the retired psychologist. So I don't know what life experiences Faye underwent to become the person that she did. And I'm sure that much of her desperation for the judge to like be up and normal again was so true. But in her selfishness and her recklessness, she disrupted the healing process that Dr. Cortland had him on.
All right. Yeah. So this is a key scene. And she laid hands on him, as the nurse says. And, you know, why does he die? What has happened? It evidently is a stroke. We'll hope if Ray's here or other doctors are here, I think doctors in my classes before have said, you know, it's probably a stroke or a heart attack. I don't think we can lay it at her. You know, we can't say that it wouldn't have happened otherwise, but it certainly could have contributed. So Harriet.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the passage of the moment where he changes physically and goes dusky, and the description is as if he's underwater. I'm thinking about all the drownings in Welty, but his death is while he's nowhere near water. It's described as you know, as if water were being poured over him. I just wanted to say that I don't like Faye. You know, on the one hand, I'm saying I think we need to think about what she means and that there are ways in which she's an ambiguous figure, but I also think she's the embodiment of selfishness and of lack of compassion. And at the same time, I am really sensitive to the idea, to the second wife thing, having had a mother and a stepmother myself, and that the moment she walks into the hospital and it's from Dr. Cortland and Laurel and the judge, there's suddenly a sense of the reality of this other marriage that is more real than Faye. But, you know, I'm thinking about Faye as a grotesque or as a gargoyle of femininity, too. I mean, there's so much to appreciate and love in Welty's comedy of femininity in lots of her stories. And here these are not scenes that are funny, but there are some scenes where her green stiletto heels and tottering on them and her peach satin on the bed suggest let us go to a place of comic femininity that's kind of repulsive.
Okay, all right, Jessica, and then
Speaking a little
Joelle.
bit of comic femininity, I was like really appreciating things about Faye that Lauren Rhodes and Laura Thayer and that Jacob said. We're talking about Faye. She's an outsider, other person from this suspicious land called Texas. And when we contrast her with Dr. Cortland, go ahead.
Go
Dr.
ahead. I'm sorry.
Cortland is presented in a really pleasant light. There's this one line about Dr. Cortland that says the Mississippi country that lay behind him was all in his face. And so he's presented in this pleasant light, and yet Faye sees something about him that I wrote down LOL Faye next to it, but she said something like, well, he's not as perfect as he seems, because she says, I saw him spank that nurse. And so I really appreciated Faye being the voice that was able to bring that. And, you know, we may like Dr. Cortland, but it is a different era. It is the 1960s, as you say, and Faye was kind of noticing that. I just had to speak up for her in that moment.
Joellen.
Thanks. First, I just want to comment on Harriet's note of the word dusky when the judge dies. Isn't that the same word in
It is. I meant to say that.
Beginnings that Welty uses of her father when he's receiving the blood transfusion from her mother, and that he goes dusky? And this is totally aside, but I've always had a question about that, because
it is exactly the same word, and I think it's it's not an accident, you know.
No,
that there's that.
And she was there witnessing this. But I think she also says something about them perhaps not knowing about blood types, but blood types were known about in the World War I. So that has befuddled me a little bit. But anyway, there is that really close link to her own biography. And otherwise, I just want to comment right here that I'm with Laurel, though this time I'm with Lauren. This time my reading, I haven't been as impatient with Laurel as I often am. Laurel is the one who's put me off more than I think I'm supposed to have been put off in the past. That may be different this read, I don't know, but I think we'll have plenty of opportunity to give Faye her due. But let's also not forget the Dalzells who were introduced, or at least Mr. Dalzell in this section. They're also out-of-towners.
Yeah, out-of-towners and other,
Yeah.
Now from Texas, we have Sarah Ford.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that. I'm really enjoying this conversation about how we feel about Faye. I wonder about the reader experience of reading Faye, because I don't like Faye. I don't think I'm supposed to like Faye, but I feel bad that I don't like Faye because I think it's a class issue. I think a lot of what she does is tagged as lower class, and she seems to me to be paralleled by that other family in the room and in the waiting room, the Dalzells, who keep joking about things that maybe, you know, in polite society you don't joke about. Someone dying of not getting enough water and they start laughing about it. So I feel as a reader, I'm in a really weird situation where I have this opinion, but I don't want to have this opinion because it makes me feel like I'm being judgmental?
I think this is an important question for us to ask because there clearly is a class difference, and the Dalzells, Mr. Dalzell in the room with the judge, the Dalzells in the waiting room with Faye, as opposed to Laurel and Dr. Cortland and the judge. What do you think? Is this a kind of issue of class and of looking down at class, Harriet?
Yeah, I think class is tremendously important in the novel. And I think I was going to say, what I was going to say, I remember being in a conversation at the Societies for the Study of Southern Literature about what is the South, and in which it was argued that Texas is not the South because Texas is nouveau South. It's like an underclass South pretending to be the South without all of the proprieties of the South. But I was thinking about Dr. Cortland, and I mean, Dr. Cortland is on the one hand a very sympathetic character who is close to the family, and he doesn't want to do the operation because he doesn't want to be responsible if the outcome is bad. And we know that there's something there in his previous history with Becky and her illness. But he is also a very authoritative doctor who comes in with a lot of manner, a lot of male manner, and Faye approaching this doctor from another class. The portrait of medicine there, I think, is more ambiguous than clear.
I think so too. He comes in, of course, like an athlete after the surgery, celebrating,
Right, exactly.
And there's that. I also want to say, I think class is important here, but I don't think it's Welty looking down at class. I think it's her noticing the differences between class, but I think we find in the course of the novel that those people in the upper class behave just about as badly in different ways as the characters in the lower class do. And then I was thinking also about Mr. Dalzell's daughter in the waiting room, and when Laurel and Faye are about to have a fight, and she's the one who says, whoa, let's, when Faye spits at Laurel, let's pull back, let's stop here. And so that I think it's more complex.
Yeah, it's not class snobbery. This book is about it's a portrait of a relationship between classes, and it's there's a whole lot more to tease out than to say that it's snobbish about class.
Mary, and then John.
Yes, on page 887, there were some passages that were significant to me. Midway through the page, there's a paragraph when they're trying to Dr. Cortland is talking to them about treatment plans. And it reads, Laurel looked for a moment into the experienced face, so entirely guileless. And then this is such a prize sentence. The Mississippi country that lay behind him was all in it. And in a way, there almost seems to be a dangerous trust in the doctor, because down a little further, Dr. Cortland wants to get another doctor from Houston in to treat him. And at the bottom of the page, Judge McKelvey says, what for? Nate, I hide myself away from home and comfort and track down here and put myself in your hands for one simple reason. I've got confidence in you. Now show me I'm still not too old to exercise good judgment. And so that kind of reminds me of a kind of thinking, not necessarily right or wrong, kind of a parochial thinking, that because I know somebody and he's from my area, that I'm going to put my total trust in him.
Here we also have a little competition. Faye says, why am I not being consulted? I'm the wife,
Right.
And Dr. Cortland is looking to Laurel and the judge. And okay, John, and then Cheryl.
Am I on?
Yeah, you're on.
I did not care for Faye, and I'm not saying that I still do or that I do now, but I think to me, what I've and some of this from the conversation today, but struggled with what did the judge see in her that attracted him to her and make him want to marry her. And I think it's got to be more than just plain loneliness. I think and I'm also thinking of his background as a judge for his number, which includes criminal cases as well as civil cases. I mean, he is, and even on both sides, he has certainly seen the worst of the worst in his lifetime and in sentencing people. And then he has this remark to the doctor that he's the optimist, and that he, to me, that means he saw something in her that just escapes other people, and that he was attracted to her enough to marry her. So I think there's, to me, the quest is, well, what is it? And trying to figure what that is.
I don't think we're ever going to ultimately know, but I think it becomes clearer as we move through the novel. Finally, a mystery, but we have a better understanding it as we go. But John, I love your point about him being a judge, him evaluating all kinds of situations and individuals, and yet he's married Faith. Yeah. Okay, Cheryl. Whoops, we can't hear you.
Sorry, guys. The way that the judge initially responds to Laurel's reading of Nicholas Nickleby to him, I think is like really important because of just the paternal, the father-daughter relationship, but also it was something that kind of clicked for him and helped reinvigorate him. But then thinking about Laurel's a daughter, Faye's a wife, and they alternate shifts. So when Laurel is there, he's able to partake in like the more serious aspects of life. But then when Faye is there, it's more of the whimsical, and that's not like bashing her. It's just he gets fed both of these things from these two women.
I think it's interesting that Laurel does read to him, and what she reads to him. She reads first a current murder mystery, and then she reads an older one, and then she moves to Nicholas Nickleby. And she says she doesn't read with the vivacity of her mother. Her parents have read to each other in the past, Becky and Clinton. And so this is going to be something we want to think about as we move on as well. Here's a picture from Jessica of a set of Dickens. And this set of Dickens we don't know about yet, but it's going to come into the novel that belonged to Chestina Welty. And of course, Nicholas Nickleby, one of the volumes in that set. So we'll be looking for that as we move forward in the novel. Was there someone whose hand I'm missing here? So let's think about, we've talked a lot about Faye. What about anything else about the judge that we want to talk about? We focus on him. And I'm glad John moved us in that direction. We've got about 6 minutes. We've spent all our time on Faye. I'm not surprised. And there are passages that we could read and talk about. But let's talk about the judge. What about Laurel? Anything about Laurel that we haven't said that you think we should talk about? So we're wondering, why has the judge let Faye into his life? What is she someone whose wishes he can grant? Is she someone who would be easy to please if she were your spouse? You know what she might be wanting. What about the books that Laura is reading? Does the judge anticipate ongoing restrictions? That is, he's not going to get his vision back. He's going to be greatly limited. Is that a cause for his depression? He's in a kind of depression here. 3 weeks go by. First, he seems to be paying attention. Then Laurel finally is just reading silently, and he's turning the pages. What's going on with him here? Helen?
Towards the end of the chapter, when Laurel comments that, it's before he dies, but that she's looking out the window at this is early. She's looking out the window and she can't see the river, and she can hardly see the bridge that would span the river. And she sees the river, her father, as the river that's out of sight. She cannot see it moving, that it's the life-giving river, that it's stagnant. And she thinks of the way her father is responding to this. The bridge, of course, refers to her. Anyway, I just thought that was pertinent, that that the river she saw in that river, the river she couldn't see, parallel to her father. They don't know exactly where he is in his head at this point. He's tuned everything out and is just lying there as if he's ticking off the time.
I was going to try to read that passage. I think it's on 901.
It's just before she lowers the blind to the just leave a tiny little bit there, which she later sees Faye.
Oh, you're talking in the early passage where they can't see they can't see the bridge. And when she comes in at the end, the bridge is brilliantly in sight. The blind is down again. Yeah. And Eudora does talk in her introduction to the Franklin Library about the meaning of the river and the river of life sort of image that is important here in the novel. Harriet? Did you have something?
Yeah, I was actually trying to find the passage where the judge says, that what he says to Dr. Cortland, don't prove something about his judgment still being intact.
Right.
And I was trying to get the line because I think that it raises a question for us to ask about the judge's judgment over the course of the novel. Is I think something that the idea of thinking about him as judge is also setting up. And I also
his vision, he has started seeing behind him. You wonder if he's not looking back to the past, to what he's lost, as opposed to what he now has with Faye. And maybe he's in a deep depression because he's married to Faye, or maybe he's in a depression because he is losing his maybe his judgment, certainly his vision, both metaphoric and literal.
Yeah,
is affected.
That question about that we maybe answered too quickly about what he dies of, where it does he may have a stroke, but he's also dying on that bed in the whole time that he is holding himself still with the sense of restraint and of a painful restraint that is killing him. Dr. Cortland says maybe we asked too much of him, and maybe they did. But the idea of restraint versus lack of restraint, which is what Faye has, is another way of framing the novel. Yeah.
There's also that line where he said Laurel recalls that her grandfather said, if you let them tie me down, I'll die. I think she thinks that her mother said, if you let them tie me down, I'll die. And of course, the judge now is tied down. And when Laurel says that, Faye says, well, being tied down is not a matter of life or death, is it? But it is a matter of life and death. And there's that notion of that restraint of, I think it's not necessarily the not expressing yourself, but the idea that your life is not going to have the same direction and purpose, that you've been a judge, you've been a central person in the life of the community, you've pushed the life of the community forward, and now those things are, all you can do now is make Faye happy, and that's a kind of restraint of old age here, I think. Mary?
I have one quick question, comment. This is so obvious, I don't even know if I need to say it. You cannot read very far without seeing references to light and darkness.
Right.
So there is just this kind of foreshadowing with that from the very beginning.
Yeah. So this whole question of depression, I think, is one, the judge's depression and the sources of that depression is one we need to consider. And I think Harriet's pushing in a different direction. You're pushing in the fact that he has led a life of restraint, whereas Faye lacks restraint, right? And I'm saying the restraints are the restraints that come with old age, that come with loss.
No, I'm not, I don't mean to push that in the direction that he's lived a life of restraint, but I do think that restraint is an issue for Laurel. And so I think it's an issue in the novel.
I think it's the key issue for Laurel.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, Jessica, I think we probably, I've got some background information I was going to share about the novel, but I can do that next time. I think we've.
Yes, I was just saying it's about that time to wrap it up. Do you have any concluding thoughts, Suzanne?
No, I can't summarize anything. I'm just at a loss here. I think we've had a great discussion, and I think we've addressed a lot of the key issues of the novel. I think the whole issue of loss and how you deal with loss is yet to come, and that's going to be the central issue that we need to talk about, the nature of memory. And I'm going to suggest that for the future, we might want to think about Faye as the, I shouldn't say as well, it's the George Santos of our time. So let's think about, see if you think of Faye as a
Okay, well, next week we'll discuss part 2.
All right.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.